As soon as you start walking across the field, the first thing you notice is how hard and lumpy it is underfoot. In fact, walking over it is quite difficult in places. The reason is clay. The soil all around here is a heavy clay, and when it dries it sets hard like concrete. The reason for the lumpiness is that when it was softer and wetter, the ground was churned up by cattle, and there is a close connection between the two. A heavy clay soil is a poor medium for growing food, but it's far better for growing grass, and therefore for pasturing livestock, both sheep and cattle. That's why the landscape in this area is dominated by fields for grazing or by fields growing silage crops for winter feed. That's also why there were once several smallholders in the parish, with dairy herds of no more than a dozen or so beasts, of which more later. Let's have a look at the map of the footpath from the road across to Hagditch and Three Corner Piece. I'll call it the Chapel Green footpath. The path crosses three fields: Chapel Green, Slade and Hagditch. These fields are a legacy from the enclosure of the village in the late 1700s. Before then, there were three huge open fields surrounding the village, each worked in strips by the people of the village. And here's a map of the open fields transposed upon a map from the late 1800s. And here is Chapel Green Pond, a well-established pond, and the faint trace of a gully leading from the pond to the drain at the field's edge tells us this is probably spring-fed, and in wet weather the excess water drained from the pond to the ditch. This also tells us this field has been home to dairy cattle probably since the late 18th century. This is typical of the scale of the ponds that proliferated the landscape until the advent of mains water. This map shows the scale of the ponds in the immediate area in 1880. The Chapel Green pond is marked in blue. But why are there so many ponds? People assume ponds are natural features of the landscape, but most are man-made to provide a source of water for livestock. This is especially important for dairy cattle, but before farmers had access to mains water to fill drinking troughs, they created ponds. The clay soil helped to line the ponds so as to retain water, but unless there was a fresh supply of water flowing into the pond, they would dry up in hot weather. This means that many ponds were sited adjacent to watercourses, all fed by springs, like the Chapel Green pond. If we look at this map of the watercourses around this area, we can see there is a spring rising alongside the road leading to the sewage works that flows across this field in wet weather, draining into the ditch at the west side of the field. Just like ponds, another feature of the landscape that points to small dairy herds are tiny milking parlours like this one. Very few exist now. A survey of 1878 shows that there was a building here then, so perhaps this structure is older than it looks, or is built on something much older. Leonard Harwood was typical of many smallholders farming a few adjoining fields. You can see that this parlour was supplied with electricity and mains water, but Leonard, like most of his contemporaries, was hand milking to the end, and like all the other smallholder dairy farmers, Leonard couldn't afford modern milking equipment. As a result, small herd dairy farming became no longer viable from the late 1950s onward, and it is unlikely this parlour has been used for 60 years. Those of you who have watched my film about the history of Carter's Lane will recall I ventured along Sturt Lane, the gated road to Hogshaw, and pointed out the abandoned medieval village alongside the road. The location of the village is partly revealed by earthworks, but mainly by the linear clumps of nettles that are indicators of masonry or ground disturbance. When I first ventured up here to the higher level of Chapel Green, I immediately noticed a similar pattern of soil disturbance, strongly suggesting there were once buildings here in the drier part of the landscape, looking down upon the flooded land below, very similar to the situation at Fullbrook. No structures are marked on maps, suggesting that whatever was here may have been centuries ago. A word about field names. We're now walking across a field called Slade, or Big Field, heading towards a much bigger field called Hagditch. Whilst a few field names can be linked to farmers like Tom Cox's, or buildings like the chapel, and some to the nature of the land like Cat's Brains, or what is on it like the pool and pool field, many have names that are likely to have been derived from the pre-enclosure names given to sections of the open fields or clusters of furlongs, like the Slad and the Gog. In fact, some of these words have Saxon roots. Slade or Slad is Saxon for an open space between banks or woods, in other words, a valley, while Gog means a bog or quagmire. Hagditch appears to be a fusion of the words hag and ditch. Its true origin is lost, but we can be confident it is probably of Mercian origin. This area was part of Mercia in Saxon times, and has been a local place name since the 8th or 9th century. The Saxon word ditch, D-I-C-H-E, is a direct root of our word ditch, and was used to describe a wall or a ditch. As far as hag is concerned, I believe it relates to the Saxon word hag, H-A-E-G, meaning an enclosed piece of land, a meadow. The Mercian pronunciation would have been hag, so a hag ditch to the Mercian Saxons was a meadow enclosed by a wall or a ditch. It is soon clear that Hagditch Field is very big indeed. In fact, at one time it was divided between three tenants: Leonard Harwood, Ernest Seaton and Archie Higgins. An aerial picture taken in 1945 clearly shows the modern field subdivided. But it's Archie Higgins whose name is most closely linked to Hagditch, and some of Archie's farm buildings are still visible today. Archie, typical of most smallholders, had a small dairy herd and kept chickens. In those days the farm was owned by the county council, but after Archie's death it was purchased from the council and remains in private hands, now being owned by George Cheshire. As part of the medieval open field, the Westfield, Hagditch was extensively covered with ridge and furrow workings. This satellite picture reveals them, and anyone walking across the field notices them. On the return leg, as we walk across Chapel Green towards the road, we approach the rookery opposite Chapel House. The rook is a member of the crow family. It is a large, gregarious black bird, distinguished from similar species by the whitish featherless area on the face. Rooks nest collectively in the tops of tall trees, often close to farms or villages, the groups of nests being known as rookeries. They forage on arable land and pasture, probing the ground with their strong bills and feeding largely on grubs on soil-based invertebrates. Historically, farmers have accused the birds of damaging their crops and have made efforts to drive them away or kill them. Rookeries were often perceived as nuisances in rural Britain, and it was previously the practice to hold rook shoots, where the juvenile birds, known as branchers, were shot before they were able to fly. These events were both very social and a source of food. Rook and rabbit pie was considered a great delicacy. In fact, the trees that house this rookery are not particularly ancient, and the copse doesn't appear on a 1900 map, suggesting it was created during the 20th century. The noise nuisance of a rookery is quite significant, especially during the breeding season in April. Although very similar in appearance to crows, rooks behave quite differently. In particular, the rook is far more gregarious. An old West Country saying has it that if he see a crow in a flock, 'tis a rook, and if he see a rook on his own, 'tis a crow. Rookeries are a constant source of noise and clamour. They are not considerate neighbours.